So welcome to our webinar, Significant Disproportionality, Moving Our Work Forward. My name is Connie Silva, and I'm here with the State Performance Plan Technical Assistance Project. I think as you all know, we are funded by the California Department of Education. We have a full 90 minutes of information for you today. So I'm going to go ahead and start by asking Jack Brimhall to get us started with a little bit of information for our session today. Jack?
Thanks, Connie. Hi, everybody. I see a lot of familiar names and faces out there, so it's good to be with you. I'm excited for today because just as the presentation is titled Moving Our Work Forward, that's what we're going to do today. And so that's exciting to me. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jack Brimhall, and I am the administrator for the Focus Monitoring and Technical Assistance Unit 1 and 4. You'll hear the acronym FMTA a lot, and if you haven't heard it, you will hear it, and most of you are aware of it, but there's 5 of those units at the California Department of Education in the Special Education Division, and I am currently the administrator of 2 of them, and we work with the intensive tier of the monitoring. And for those of you that are significantly disproportionate, that automatically puts you in the intensive tier. I did want to share with you some changes at the California Department of Education in the Special Education Division, because there have been a number of them. Some of you may be aware of these changes, but just so we're all on the same page. Kristen Wright, our director, is leaving here in June, and she accepted a job with the Sacramento County Office of Education as the executive director of Equity, Diversity, Early Intervention, and Support Services. So we're going to miss her, but we'll have that opening. In the meantime, Shiloh Bessaril is going to be our interim associate director, and then I am going to be the interim administrator too, over the Focus Monitoring and Technical Assistance units. So even though there are a lot of changes, we're moving forward, and we're excited about moving forward, even though we're going to miss Kristen. Today, what we're here to do is provide information on what LEAs can currently be working on in regards to significant disproportionality. I think one of the biggest things to come out of today will be the pacing guide that you're introduced to. And the pacing guide gives you a really thorough look at where your LEA needs to be in order to meet the due date for the CCEIS plan.
I wanted to see if I could.
And so if you haven't heard, the SEP, the Special Education Plan, and the CCEIS plan, the Comprehensive Coordinated Early Intervening Services Plan, are now due December 15th. So that's been changed a couple of times. We tried to align it, and we have aligned it with the LCAP. And that was based on feedback from the field so that LEAs didn't have a variety of due dates. The LCAP was changed to December 15th. And so now the Special Education Plan is December 15th. Part of the Special Education Plan is, within that is significant disproportionality, even though that's a general education plan, and that is going to be due December 15th. So a couple of things before I let you go, I would say that you need to make sure that you're doing is make sure you have a TA facilitator and you work with them. We have a bunch of really, really great TA facilitators. In fact, John and Mildred and Dennis, who are your panelists today, are fantastic. And then also know your FMTA consultant. So whichever FMTA consultant you have in your region, make sure you know them, because they work closely with the TA facilitator. Anyway, happy to be here and glad to see everybody.
Thank you, Jack. So before we get started, I just quickly want to go over what our objectives are for today. So why you're here. Hopefully you're going to be learning some strategies for managing and prioritizing your CCEIS plan, the development timelines, during this particular time where we have social distancing in place. And we know that some of that is going to probably be continuing even when you go into next year. We're going to explore a new tool, and Jack mentioned one of them, but we have a tool also on policies, procedures, and practices on that federally required review. So you'll get information on that. Well, you're going to have an opportunity to share ideas and thoughts with your colleagues. So we have a few breakout sessions. I'll say more about that in a little bit, but we are going to have some interactive activities. So you'll be able to interact with your colleagues during today's session. And then again, there's other resources that we'll be talking about at the end of the session. So in addition to what we're providing today, we have more to share coming up. So just real quickly, this is kind of an agenda for the day, but not necessarily in this order, some of the things that we will be covering. So you're going to get some general updates. So you've heard some already from Jack, and we have some more to share during the session. You'll also be, as I said, introduced to sorry about that. Things got moved around. Okay, we have we have some cameras that are coming on. So I just want to take a minute to say, please turn your camera off if you're not actually presenting. We will have you turn them on during our breakout sessions. So we have also some panel presentations. You'll be hearing from our three panelists, Dr. Mildred Browne, Dr. Dennis Doyle, and Dr. John Eyler. During today's session, we are going to have breakout sessions, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Again, everyone will be interacting during those breakout sessions. You'll get more information, but two of them specifically today, one on file reviews and one on data. And then, as I mentioned, there's two different tools you're going to be introduced to, the policies, practices, and procedures matrix, and also the pacing guide. And then at the end, we will talk about our opportunities and resources going forward that we also have to offer you. So with that, I want to move into the body of what we're going to be doing today, but just setting up a couple of the norms for what to expect. Again, in our main room, when we're in our main room, we'll have only the panelist cameras off. So you'll want to make sure that your video and your mic are both off. If you leave them on and we have to turn them off, unfortunately, you won't be able to turn them back on later. So please try to keep your eye on that and just turn them off when we're in the main room. We do want you to use chat. We know that there are lots of questions, and to the extent that we can respond to your questions today, we will. But even if time is short and we're not able to get to you, well, we will definitely be looking at chat to create a frequently asked questions document for you. So please don't hesitate to put your questions and comments in chat. They're always very helpful to us. When you're in the breakout rooms, when you have your cameras on, you can use your emojis. So that will be helpful if you want to give reactions to the comments that people in your room are making. It's a nice way to let them know what you're thinking without adding more to the dialogue, especially if time is short. Those breakouts are going to be about 10 minutes. And as I mentioned earlier, during the breakouts, we will ask you to turn your audio on and your video on so that you can participate in the brief sessions that we have for the breakouts. Okay? All right, so I also want to say that during today's session, I'm going to be sharing various documents. So please bear with me for those short delays while we're changing screens. So what I want to show you now is the pacing guide. So, and this pacing guide that Jack mentioned already is really provides the structure for our day. So you should be able to see it on your screen now. I'm going to start by showing you just the basic, there's an instruction page. So basically, let me describe this very briefly before I ask our panelists to speak to this. This was created to help you with your full 27-month period of your CCEIS plan development and implementation. So it covers the full 27-month period, but what it's meant to do is give you sort of a quick checklist document that you can keep track of where you are in your development and in your implementation. So you'll notice it's actually, again, divided up by phases. Each page, phase 1, phase 2, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. And phase 4 is all about the implementation and the reports that you'll be submitting. So today, the bulk of our time is going to be on phase 1 and phase 2. But what I want to point out is that it lists the task, a target date. This is not a due date. It's a date that will help LEAs as you're planning your activities and completing your activities to keep you on track for that deadline. So as Jack mentioned, the new deadline for the CCEIS plan is December 15th. So we have changed some of the target dates on this to help you, if you follow this more or less, again, it doesn't have to be exactly, you will be on track for completing your plan in time and then being able to implement it as soon as possible. You'll also notice there's a column so you can actually list, again, if you're tracking this and using this as a team, when something has been completed. And then on the resources column, there's any resources that are tied to that, and the links here are live. So when you receive this document, you can actually use it with the links to the resources that would be helpful for each of those activities. This is a document that can be individualized, and we're hoping that LEAs will use it and create, you can put your own dates in here. Again, just keep in mind the target ones that we put in there for you. But again, they're not hard and fast deadlines. They're meant to keep you on track. I am going to move this to the phase, well, I'll leave it here for now. And I'm going to go ahead and ask John and Dennis and Mildred. We're going to hear from all three of you. And I think we're going to begin with John and just provide any strategies or tidbits that you have particular to phase 1 and people's use of this document and what can be done right now, given our particular circumstances where we are in a shelter-in-place situation.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Connie. I just have a couple points that I wanted to kind of share. I think this is helpful because it gives somewhat of a process, and I think what I was hearing a lot of from a lot of administrators were, what can I do to kind of check off the list, if you will, in terms of phase 1 and phase 2. So I think this is super helpful. I appreciate just the hyperlinks that take you directly to the resources. So I think this is a great tool. A couple things around phase 1. I think the leverage piece in terms of root cause is something to think about in the very beginning. I was just working with a district this morning, and what's looking like a special education SIG-DIS root cause process is now turning into something that's much more integrated and connected with their differentiated assistance work and other root cause engagements that they have around improvement for their district. So I would encourage that from the onset, that you consider how this 4-phase process can not be a set aside or a set alone specifically to address significant disproportionality, but how it can actually be integrated as part of your other improvement efforts within your system. I like to say that this isn't necessarily the body of work that people are like, yes, put me on that committee. I want to be on the SIG-DIS committee. Oftentimes it's kind of the default feels very compliance oriented, kind of punitive in nature. And so the more that we can couch that in other improvement work, I think the better it is from the onset. Another piece is the team that you put around looking at data. I think is important to have a diverse team that's not just special education personnel around the table. Yes, they can talk the language. They know the indicators probably more than anyone else around the table, but this is really a system-owned priority, a system-owned challenge. And so I would suggest from the onset that you be very intentional about putting people around the table who are really going to collectively own that. 2 other points. One, with regard to root cause, as you're going through kind of the selection of your strategy and what tools you would use, I would encourage that you take both a qualitative and a quantitative approach to looking at this. And I think Mildred's going to dive into this a little bit more when she talks about file reviews, but there should be an explicit effort to gauge the beliefs and perceptions of various stakeholders in the system, in addition to some quantitative analysis that will surface some of the potential beliefs and structures that you may want to focus on. Last thing I would mention is I would encourage you to be very intentional around a communication plan. The default around significant disproportionality tends to carry some negative connotations in a punitive kind of feel. And so without an explicit strategy of communication around it, I think you're running up against that default narrative. And so one of the things I've done is ask districts to, there's the initiative inventory is a phase 1 activity, I believe. It sits in phase 1, but it's just really kind of taking stock of what are we chasing down as a district. I would also encourage you to take a list or a closer look at what are the whys, what are the major kind of heart tug drivers in your district. We're about equity, we're about whole child, we're all means all. It's those types of things that I would use to bring into a communication plan. When I say communication plan, it's very simple. It's simply, who are the stakeholders? What do you want them to hear? And what are you asking them to message? That's all it is. So superintendent, what do you want your superintendent to hear? What do you want your superintendent to message? Your board, your bargaining unit leadership, your teachers, and so on. So those are some little pieces I think have been helpful in the initial stages of kind of couching this work and being intentional with how you move forward in it.
Dennis, you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess, I want to first of all say thank you all for the wonderful adaptations you've been making in these trying circumstances. It's hard to believe that 2 months ago, we were in classrooms with children. And in that short period of time, we're now living our lives on Zoom. But we're adapting, you're adapting. And we want you to know that it's all of us, our commitment to students that we're committed to. And in particular, on behalf of all of the facilitators, we're deeply committed as well to helping you in the LEAs in these uncertain times, to help you to develop and to implement your SACE plans. So first tip I would offer is, if you haven't already done so, contract, write up an MOU, develop a consultant services agreement with a TA facilitator to get you from now to the end of this fiscal year, June 30th. And write out a description of what you and the facilitator are going to be doing as you enter into the next fiscal year. You can use this pacing guide to keep you on track to meet deadlines. But if you begin to write out what you're going to do ahead of time, you'll see that you have some clear benchmarks that you will meet as you follow the pacing guide as it's laid out. Now, the facilitators have been leaning on each other a whole lot more now, trying to figure out how to be much more effective in the online environment, and we're experimenting. None of us have worked under these kinds of circumstances in the past. You'll find that the facilitators are working in groups of LEAs and working with SELPAs. We've developed some new, unique, fluid configurations for the sake of efficacy. The second tip is leadership team. Again, if you haven't already done so, make a list of possible leadership team members. You can go to the SPP-TAP website, pull down the leadership and stakeholder identification worksheet, and talk that through with your facilitator. Now, we know that many of you are anticipating staffing changes. I was working with an LEA earlier this week, and the director of special ed said, I'm not going to be the director of special ed after June 30th. We know there's lots of changes coming, but what's most important is that you get a sense of what the whole will look like for your leadership team, for your stakeholders group, and what the role of the individuals will be so that the SACE work can move forward in a smooth manner. You know somebody's going to come into the position who isn't there yet. Leave a placeholder for that person so that when they arrive, they know what the expectations are. They see how they fit into the work in its entirety. We're all dispersed right now. This is a different way of working than we've done this kind of work in the past. So communication is really what is going to pull us together. As I mentioned, get, first of all, to recap, the facilitator contract in place, get your leadership team, stakeholders, schedule out all of your meetings, standing meetings, check-in appointments, use the pacing chart to put those dates into as much of a concrete schedule as you can, using design thinking, right? Doing backward design from your end date of December 15th. John mentioned communication, and I would only echo that, particularly as your superintendent may have a designee on the leadership team. Make sure that designee is communicating with the superintendent at every level. This down, up, down communication is really, really important to help us to overcome the barriers of time and space. over communication is the way that we do that. So in closing, I guess I'd just say that we have accepted the challenge to innovate and to find new ways to move forward for kids who historically have been marginalized. This is a moral imperative for us. And bottom line is we have not paused in this crisis. We've pivoted, and we're looking forward to finding new ways to work effectively with you for greater impact. Mildred?
Thanks, Dennis. I want to say that please reiterate the pacing guide. I do not, even though I love all my districts, I do not want to spend Thanksgiving dinner with you working on the plans. So let me jump in a little bit into the stakeholder group. We've talked a little about the leadership team, but the stakeholder group is really going to be a good opportunity as far as bringing your community and your parents together so that they can also be a part of your collaborative team. And I'm saying the parents are the ones that you're going to recruit who are a part of your identified group. So if you are significant disproportionate for African American students, then you're going to have African American parents. One good way, people always say, well, I'm not really sure which parents. Many times the teachers have good relationships with those parents and they'll recruit them. They also, particularly if they are leaders in the school and already assuming other roles, someone always knows another friend who is someone can partner as far as coming in to your stakeholder group. And the stakeholder group is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing group of individuals who will be working with you, listening to the strategies that are part of your plan after the plan has been approved, as well as supporting the efforts and the communication plan that John mentioned. I'm going to jump into the file review and spend a little more time when we're in our next panel discussion on the rest of the qualitative review. The file review is a part of the qualitative review because it is not a technical review of a student's file. It really is an opportunity to learn about the journey that students have in your district. How did they happen to come to be in special education? Were they identified in another district before they landed into your district, or did they grow up in the district? What was their journey like as far as their attendance, were there office referrals? Many times you'll see the journey into special ed may have a discipline context. So you want to be sure that you're not just tapping into the special education information. Were there pre-interventions that the student had an opportunity to have before they went for a full-blown assessment? What about Section 504? Was that a stepping stone into special education? So all of those opportunities are there as far as the file review. It's really good to have this be a team effort where you bring in your psychologists with your school administrators, or some districts are having to review so many files, are so busy. There are people that are consultants that are very good.
Okay, Mildred, did you want to go into the breakout?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right. So give me just a second here. I'm going to go back to, sorry about that. Go back to the PowerPoint. And I did want to add, I was just looking at the questions, and thank you so much. Folks are asking absolutely the questions that they should be, which is one was about the archiving of this webinar. And yes, I should have mentioned that in the very beginning. We will be, we'll be archiving the webinar. So everything you're hearing today right now is being recorded, and we'll be putting that on our website. And we will also be putting these tools on our, sorry, I'm missing those here. We are putting the tools on our website, which is one of the things I wanted to show you next. So Just a second here. So before we go into breakouts, I wanted to remind you again that all of the documents that we're going to be showing will be on our website. So definitely recommend that you use the website regularly. We have updates to some of the forms we'll be talking about later, and we want to make sure you have the latest forms, but all of the new tools that we're showing you today will definitely be posted on the website. For the most part, they're under our tab for significant disproportionality. That's where you would find these documents. Also, the resources tab on the very far right has not only the documents we're talking about today, but additional webinars and e-modules. I wanted to show that to you just as a reminder. That's SPP-TAP.org. So we're going to go into breakouts. We have very short breakouts. They're about 10 minutes, and I want to briefly explain what's going to happen. So you will be automatically put into a breakout room. There'll be 10 or so people in each room. There will be a lead person in that room who's going to facilitate your conversation. So there'll be someone in each room that's going to ask you to turn your cameras on, turn your mic on, and we'll basically walk you through these questions. They will document what's being shared in the room. So we're using a Google Doc so that we can gather the thoughts that are shared. You won't have to present that to the full breakout room, so don't worry about that. But we are wanting to record the comments, again, so that we have a resource for everyone that includes all of the strong and brilliant thoughts, creative thoughts from the participants of this webinar. So you're going to automatically be joining. You'll also be automatically be coming back. So there's a brief warning sign that will come on when you've got 1 minute left. And again, your lead in that group will give you more information. I do want to just point out that we recognize everyone is in different circumstances right now, or many of us are working at home remotely, and we don't want to assume that whatever your home situation is, that you are able to turn your camera on. Maybe you're sharing your space with, children, family, pets, whatever, and would prefer to leave it off. That's okay. But we do hope that you'll be able to participate in the breakout session, even if you choose to not show us your home. Okay. So Susan's going to go ahead and break us all up. We'll be back in 10 minutes and just do a quick debrief, okay? Okay, folks, we are going to get started. Again, as Jen mentioned, the only cameras we should be seeing right now are Mildred, John, Dennis, and myself. So if other folks could turn their cameras off, that would be great. We are just right now going to do a quick debrief. So I know that everyone ended up in their groups. I'm going to ask John, Dennis, and Mildred just to share a quick comment or two about what happened in your groups, and then we'll go on with our panel. So go ahead.
I'll start because we had the very best conversation of all of the breakout sessions. Our group talked about a good opportunity as far as being able to get a more personal perspective about each of the students and what their journey has been. Talked about trends for certain student groups. And one of the concerns was, is there trauma in the home? Have there been several change of placements? More evidence in regards to why students have been placed in special ed. Also in terms of number 2, which was about the kinds of data, we have a long list, which will be really valuable as far as sharing at the end of the session. But one that was really great was the teachers who are making the referrals. Is there a trend for the same teachers, and what grade level are students being identified? And then what are the pre-intervention strategies that are available or have been made available for those students before they're identified for special ed? Okay, Dennis?
Yeah, I think great minds think alike. Our group as well thought that the journey of the student was really, really going to be illuminated through the file review. And in particular, looking at whether or not prior interventions were tracked, looking at the 504s and if they were appropriate, looking at teacher and parent buy-in, and giving us data to analyze. For example, and you alluded to this, Mildred, from your group as well, are there particular schools or the particular grade levels, particular case managers that we find a lot of the referrals are emanating from. And then we also heard about how this is really sometimes a proxy for services that simply need to be provided to children. And you know, should they really be in special ed? This is a question that was raised. Over-identification of white ED students often is a behavior issue. And so the history and experience as well with trauma can inform through this process, and the possibilities that there might be and aren't being tapped into additional initiatives, or that there need to be initiatives that don't exist to meet the needs of students beyond special ed, were all responses to this question from our group.
Great. My group talked about really kind of looking at the journey of kids prior to the doorstep of assessment for special education. They found value in looking at whether or not identifications were coming from within the system or outside of the system moving in. And they also talked about the reevaluation process. There was a comment also about professional learning to kind of identify areas of potential professional learning in that area. And then there was a question that I would really kind of put out to the larger group, and it was basically this: is there a set template for doing a good file review? What does that look like? And so Mary Bacon, I saw you on here. Dr. Bacon, I believe, has done quite a bit of work in that area. So I would refer you to reach out to her. If other folks have a template or a spreadsheet or a strategy they use, I would encourage you to use the chat a little bit to say, hey, I've got something that I found to be really successful. If you don't have that, I encourage them to really identify 4 or 5 questions that you have that you would then take to the file review. So for example, I'd want to know, are these kids who are qualifying under ED, are those coming from within our system or outside? What's happening at the reevaluation? Are we kind of rubber stamping, eligibility, or are we doing a full reevaluation again? Those are some questions that, if you're intentional, you can go directly to your file review to answer those, as opposed to just a straight kind of one-size-fits-all approach. But yeah, I would encourage those who've gone through that process and done successful file reviews to just indicate, hey, I've got a template you can use, and share that with each other.
Okay. Before we go on to the next, did you have anything, final comments, Mildred, that you want to share on this?
Yes, I do. It really is, I'm just reinforcing what John said. It really is important to have the consistency in the process. It's so important to be sure that you're looking at the files all the same way. And Mary Bacon is brilliant in regards to being a great person for support and providing some tips around file reviews. Thank you. I think I'm going next, though.
Yeah. So I'm going to move us on to our next sort of panel session, which is going back to our pacing guide. So hopefully you can see now the pacing guide again on your screen. And what I want to do is just move us to the next phase 2. And I'm going to ask our panelists again, Mildred, John, and Dennis, to talk a little bit about the activities that are in this phase 2.
Okay, I'm going to start this time, and I'm going to just share a little bit about the qualitative review. John's going to finish with data in as far as the quantitative. And the qualitative review is also a very dynamic part of the process as far as the review. And this is where you choose a self-assessment tool, and you use that with focus groups or interviews, with all your role groups. When we're talking about role groups, we're talking about your psychologists, who is your team or team members that help with the assessment process. Do you want to talk to principals as far as part of your focus groups? We also do focus groups and have students be a participant. Students are great as far as talking about why they think things are the way they are, particularly in the area around disproportionality or how they're being treated. particularly if you're dealing with middle and high school students. Teachers, if they can be released from class. You can also use equity walks in your schools. Once you look at your data and you see that you have a higher number of referrals or suspension data at a particular school, it's good to train the staff to actually go from classroom to classroom and take a look at what the indicators are for a very positive, supportive equity. So you're looking at the school in that interview through an equity lens. It's also important to be able to have conversations with all your role groups. So you definitely are going to look at your stakeholder group and using them as a focus group, your leadership team. It's going to be very, very informative, because once you are able to get that anecdotal, and some people say very subjective data, a lot is revealed that explains the data points that are part of your quantitative data. Okay, John, or Dennis, excuse me.
Dennis is going to go next, yeah. You're still muted, Dennis. Thanks.
All right. I'm going to talk about the Local Educational Agency Initiative Inventory. It should be at the top of your screen. And this is an important piece of data. You'll find that inventory on the SPP-TAP website. As Connie said, everything is there. If you look under SACE guidance documents and the forms tab, you'll be able to bring that up. And it's a table where you'll be able to list the current initiatives, both special ed and gen ed, as they relate to behavior, school climate, social emotional learning, and you'll note what the funding source is, what group of students the initiative is targeting, whose leadership, who's on point, who are the staff responsible for driving the initiative. I will say that the LEAs I've worked with who've done this almost immediately begin to see patterns. And the patterns are fascinating. Someone described these patterns last week as almost a patchwork quilt. And they can see how a lot of these local initiatives can be grouped together because they have commonalities. But they also observed that funding comes in buckets and initiatives spring up without necessarily a whole lot of thought in terms of collaboration and integration to better align the initiatives. So when you engage in this exercise in an authentic way, you'll see right away where you can improve upon articulation, communication mechanisms, and sew these initiatives together in a more effective way systemically, from a systemic perspective. But it'll also become glaringly obvious to you that some students are not being targeted by initiatives. And this will get you right back to your SIGDIS indicators. So you'll see where you can amplify your current initiatives, be more effective, but you're effectively doing a gap analysis here. And that begins to provide a pathway for you toward the writing of your SACE plan. So just a reminder, districts, charters, the ahas don't come from filling out the form. They come from the facilitated conversations, the observations, the critical analysis. This is where you develop and test hypotheses. And this process, working together as a cohesive group, really is a catalyst to help you to move the work forward. John?
Great, thanks, Connie. If you have those slides to queue up, that would be helpful to show that.
Yeah.
As you kind of navigate over there, I can just kind of give some context for this. I'm just really going to share two slides that speak to kind of the importance of triangulation for those districts who've worked with me. I apologize that this is a repeat, if you will, but I think it's important just to understand in general. You can advance all the way through the animations on this one. So on the left-hand side, really is what we have are kind of some observations from, this is a sample from a district many years ago that was identified indicator 4. So they were looking at suspensions over 10 days for African-American youth. And what we did as a district is say, we're gonna look at multiple sources of data. And so what you have are some of the findings from that. So high emotional disturbance identification, we looked at identification patterns into special education. We looked at high African-American discipline overall as a district. Highest discipline events were in grades 7 through 12, and you can kind of read that all the way down. Towards the bottom, you'll see that there's other data points around UC-CSU preparation, achievement, graduation, and so on. What we then did in the middle was basically, I said, what are your hypothesized root causes right now? Looking at, you know, the observations that we made on the left-hand side, kind of our landing points. What are some reasons or some potential root causes? And what you see in the middle is what that team came up with. Low capacity to address challenging behaviors, particularly in middle and high school. Low fidelity at middle school and high school for tier 1. The absence of structures and expectations, foundational knowledge around race and being able to even talk about race. And so what we then did is went back to the observations and we said, okay, for high emotional disturbance identification in your district, what potential root cause might that be linked to? And so this is important because in your CCEIS plans, you will be asked to make a direct connection and a link between what are your observations in terms of data and how does that support your root cause? Oftentimes there's, you know, other motivations that come into play when there's money involved and when you have to set aside 15% of IDEA monies. People around the table have that already spent before they even enter the conversation of root cause. And so this is one way to provide some protections in that area. But what I want you to see is that there's starting to be a cluster up at the top of this around low capacity and then a cluster around the absence of structures, root causes. The right side of this are focus areas, which are no longer a requirement, but that kind of explains what the right side of this is in terms of how do we align our initiatives with one of these kind of focus areas. Kind of, if you can advance just through the next slide. If we had not used the triangulated strategy, this is what that same exercise might have looked like. So just focusing on the discipline indicators up at the top, because indicator 4, discipline, suspensions, African-American, had we only focused on that, the arrows would still point to the same root causes, but you see there's a lack of depth in terms of which of those root causes might be highest leverage and highest impact in your system. Meaning these root causes are likely impacting other portions of your system that are creating disparities for youth that are not necessarily at the point of being identified as significantly disproportionate. So this is all, you know, all to say it's important to triangulate and look at multiple data sources regardless of the identification area that your district has been identified in. So that's all I've got for you.
Thank you, John. So we are going to go into another breakout room. And, but I know we have a couple questions. I do want to say there's one that's specific to budgets, and we're going to talk about budgets later in this session. So I'm going to hold that one for the moment. I think it's a really good question. It'll be helpful for everyone to hear the answer to that. And then I'm also seeing this one from Jen Blake about the timeline and the closure around COVID. So I'm just going to read it. Many districts have been told we won't be back to typical instruction until October or even the second semester. This limits our ability to engage fully in the process. For instance, the equity walks, meeting with students, etc., will be impossible. The closures limit our ability to implement next steps that involve direct service to students and families as well. Can you speak to why postponing further to allow for fidelity in the process has not been considered? So I'm going to go ahead and give maybe the panelists just a second if somebody wants to respond to what you're thinking, you're recommending in terms of what can happen here, and I can talk a little bit about the postponing.
Yeah, I will start out, and then maybe John and Dennis want to join in, but we've already anticipated the fact that we may not be in our normal, whatever normal has been for us as far as situation. So we are already starting to work on focus groups with some groups even this spring, where we're learning to use Zoom. We know that we need to manage it a little differently as far as how many people we usually are able to do in regards to a focus group. But a lot of the strategies we're learning how to implement and support districts that we can certainly talk about. I think there's also going to be a training in June that Connie's going to mention at the end of the session that's going to talk about some strategies about how to do some of these strategies remotely But I don't think it's going to in any way get in the way of the work that we can do as far as the plans.
I can just add really quickly, I think some of the quantitative pieces you can do right now. You don't need to, those can be started. The LEA initiative inventory you can start right now. The file reviews you can start right now if that's part of your strategy. The focus groups and interviews I think are almost easier in this setting from a analysis perspective, because if you record on Zoom, you get the transcript for that. So it makes it a lot easier to go back and use a coding structure and a strategy to analyze data. So I wouldn't let that hold people back from kind of leaning into doing those focus groups and interviews.
Right, thank you. Yeah, as Mildred mentioned, we are planning actually a webinar, and I'll say more of this at the end, but we recognize that things are happening differently. You'll also notice that on the pacing guide, there is a target date that CDE has set, June 15th, for the completion of phase 1 and phase 2, which would include the analysis of your data and gathering qualitative data like focus groups and so on. And in the pacing guide, we've moved those events, some of them, to August and September, and that's because it's going to take more planning time for those. You can still get very far in the process by June 15th, very far. But it is true that you may need to do some extra strategizing to get to a true collaborative process with stakeholders, parents, and students. And I'll talk more at the end about our planned webinar that will help with that. Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and move into our next breakout session. Again, you'll be brought into rooms. There'll be a lead person there. You will be in a different room, so don't expect to see the same faces that you saw before. And Susan, you can go ahead and move us into our rooms. And we are going to, once again, we're doing good with time. Thank you everyone for being so careful about that. We are going to, once again, just ask our panelists to do a quick, 1 or 2 comment wrap up.
Well,
so,
I'm ready.
Okay.
I'd like to be able to say that I got one strategy that I think that I'm going to be able to use, and that was that for question number 2, a couple of people talked about having some norms about making sure that everyone knows from the very beginning that you are letting the student data guide decisions. And therefore, that's something that's talked about with every group, so people aren't trying to sabotage the process or go sideways. And then the talk about the budget process, in that there isn't an opportunity to utilize the budget ahead of time, even though that might be something where you might wind up providing support for a particular strategy, but you can't access the budget until your plans are approved. So that's also something that could be shared up front. And then the other was certainly to make sure that the stakeholder group is very diverse, and that the more diversity at the stakeholder, particularly when you have parent and teacher voice, that they will also be able to be very supportive in terms of dealing with the process and reviewing data. Dennis?
I'll jump right in here. So our group talked about the importance of utilizing some of the tools that have been talked about and coaching in order to make sure that there are fresh eyes that can look at and analyze the data. This is how you can get the full benefit of the process. Improvement science was also mentioned as a model that's complementary. It enables you to really analyze the data and not just jump to solutions and to see what's feasible as you're moving forward. And then with respect to making sure that personal agendas or interests of the district in terms of initiatives that folks want to fund don't dilute the process, there were some suggestions in terms of making sure that you have good solid data so that people who come in with preconceived ideas have these rebuffed. On the other hand, also keeping open to the possibility that people from the field have some very good ideas that may exactly be on point at times, and being open to learning about the whys. So I think that would probably sum up the most salient points. Thank you.
Great, thank you. John?
All right, yeah, my team had some similarities. So some of the strategies, 5 whys, fishbone, affinity grouping. There were a couple categorization type strategies where we're looking at outcomes of data and putting those into, is this a structural piece or a belief piece? Is this an SEL piece? Is this procedural, right? And kind of continuing to refine. Within the second question, there's, again, like Mildred, we had this focus on norms, accepting the truth, being introspective. And then one of the ones I think was kind of most kind of salient was this avoiding blame and having collective ownership. And I think that's, for me, pretty key. It takes a great degree of psychological safety for people to truly engage in the depths around this root cause work. And so if your norms create that safety within that environment, I think that's probably the best setup for a really productive root cause piece.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I also want to just take a moment to thank all of our participants who had some rich input there. And as a reminder, our intent is to share all of these Google documents. So we're going to combine them all from, we're doing this this session 3 different times. I'm not sure if everybody's aware of that, but we are doing it 3 different times, once today, twice tomorrow. So when we end up sharing back, we're going to be able to share back from all of the groups. So obviously there will be a lot of very rich and I think helpful ideas and things to inform everybody's work. So just so you know that all of that documentation will be shared with the whole group. So I am going to move on to our next topic, which is our other tool that we have. And Dennis and Mildred are going to be talking about this. And let me just, I'm going to go ahead and share it, but I'll just introduce it. It is our, what's called policies, practices, and procedures review matrix. So can everybody see that now? So Dennis and Mildred, you guys can say a little bit about this, but basically this is a new tool, and like the other ones that we've mentioned, it's going to be on the website. The only thing I want to say before we begin, and Mildred and Dennis say a little about this, this is not a tool that you'll do and then submit to CDE. It's really meant to be a helpful tool for your process, but you may end up with some information from this that ends up going into your CCEIS plan, and obviously that would be submitted to CDE. So go ahead, Mildred, Dennis, I'm not sure who's starting, but.
I am, and thank you. Connie, you're correct that this is a tool, and pretty much all of the information is compiled once the charts are completed. And there will be data that will need to be dropped into a box in phase 3 that talks about review of policies, practices, and procedures. This is a regulatory guidance that came about as a part of the changes around significant disproportionality as related to changes from at the federal level, where each district must address policies, practice, and procedure. And what's really exciting about this opportunity is that when you are doing the review, you will then get more information that will be added to your data points. If in fact you don't have a student study team process, or you don't have a policy, that in itself may be one of the factors you'll be looking at when you're looking at your root causes. Okay, Dennis.
Well, first I want to thank Mildred for developing this matrix and sharing it so widely with everyone so that we can comply with the federal regulatory guidance. This is a 2-stage process. The first stage involves gathering documents to review and read, and you're really doing that part prior to your root cause analysis. All of, and this is a sample matrix we're presenting to you here today, all of the board policies listed in the matrix and their companion administrative regulations where they exist should be examined as they pertain to your LEA's indicators of significant disproportionality. The second stage, Mildred said this, is to be taken up in phase 3, and that's where you do the deep dive to analyze the policies, the practices, and the procedures. That's done again after the root cause analysis. So the steps are pretty clearly laid out at the top of this document, but do take note of the dates when these board policies were written, when they were last revised. You'll want to articulate how the policies are related to the root causes of your LEA's disproportionality in the third phase, and ask tough questions. So this becomes a really important tool as you're looking at how policies and procedures address the needs of specific student groups who've historically been marginalized in school settings. You'll want to analyze these disparities in treatment among different student groups in terms of how these policies are written, looking at them with an equity lens. That's what's significant here. And asking questions. Do they reflect evidence-based practices that have a high propensity to yield effective outcomes for all students? You'll want to indicate where the responsibilities and the accountability lie. And then you're going to be looking at, I think, the second piece of this, which is whether or not there's evidence that the programs, that the policies and procedures are being implemented as they were intended and with consistency. So this is a process, again, not just checking the boxes. You might have to do interviews with staff and job alikes to look at fidelity of implementation. We had a focus group of vice principals to look at discipline, and it was just fascinating to see how their interpretations and their perspectives were so different with respect to the very same policies in their LEA. So you'll want to ask administrators questions about discipline, student study teams, both instruction and behavior, the extent to which 504s are being implemented, how robust are they, and other pre-intervention strategies. To what extent are your RTI and multi-tiered systems of support being implemented? Do they operationalize the policies and the procedures? And you'll see where you're going to provide, where you're going to need to provide more professional development and ongoing support. Someone mentioned earlier that we have lots and lots of new staff coming in who aren't familiar with this. So you're going to look at does your district have a behavioral matrix, for example? The programs and policies together present an infrastructure for the beliefs of your LEA. And they provide the cultural lens then, as you've reviewed them, to guide you in deciding where you're not in alignment in practice with your belief system. So you're going to, in the third phase, be doing some writing in some cases, as you can see in this example, some rewriting, some revising, some updating, looking to see, in fact, are handbooks in place? Are they up to date? Are manuals in place? Again, this is not a comprehensive list. This is a minimal list for review that reflects access and opportunity for all students. And then once you do the revisions in phase 3, how do you communicate that out through school board minutes, through your LEA website, and through additional trainings that might take place? You're going to need a measurable outcome, and there's a sample that is at the very bottom of the document, and you have the opportunity as well to write your own measurable outcomes for the CCEIS plan. I'm going to wind it up at this point and turn it over to John. We're going to talk a little bit about budget review.
So there's a question. I'm just going to go ahead and voice this. Feel it would be appropriate to request the board policies for elementary level or the high school districts that are gathering data. So inquiring about their practices and interview their school district leadership and other staff.
Yeah, I would say that's very appropriate. I know in one of the charter school systems that I'm working with, they're doing exactly that. And we're also working through the SELPA. We can see where a lot of the referrals were made and how some of the policies are being implemented in ways that aren't necessarily as they perhaps were intended, and the SELPA is playing a large part in that. But I would suggest that makes a great deal of sense for the high school districts as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do want to point out what I'm sharing with folks is a sample, so it's been filled out. We have a blank template for you that is basically blank, but it does include a list of the board policies that are highly recommended, sort of at minimum, that you would review. So when you take a look at both of them, you'll see a blank one. That again, just has some policies listed. It's not all inclusive. There's probably others that you'll want to take a look at, but it does provide some of those. And then again, the sample, just to give you a sense of what it would look like when it's completed. So anything else before we move on to the next topic? Great. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing this one. And then what we're going to move on to, we have a couple questions, and I'm sure we'll end up with more tied to budgets. And we actually do have a few slides, and John's going to run us through these slides that are specific to budgets, because we know this is a real key time for information. So let me go ahead and share my screen again with the
So Connie, as you're getting that ready, I can just kind of set this up to say that in the phase one process, I think it's important to start talking with your CBOs about this piece if you hadn't already done so. And what I found myself doing is kind of having the conversation over and over and over again. And so I just created an animation of this to kind of help explain and visualize really what this truly means in terms of set aside monies. So what you'll see is the top part are Part B funds. They kind of fall into two buckets, if you will, resource 3310 and 3315. And what this means is not new money. Obviously, I think just a lot of people on this webinar know that, but I think it's important for CBOs to understand what this means, especially given the challenges that we're up against next year. But it's taking 15% of 3310, dropping that into 3312. Taking 15% of 3315 and dropping that into a new resource code, 3318. That's what forms your allocation for the next 27 months to implement your CEIS plan. Up at the top, you'll see that there's a gap in Part B funds, and this isn't something that we can just not address. And so what you'll find is the general fund or the general contribution, local contribution, there's an increase in the LEA's local contribution to offset or backfill those Part B funds, which then has a long-term effect in terms of your maintenance of effort. And so I think there's two kind of fiscal consequences. One, obviously the 15% set aside, but I think the ongoing implication of this is an increased MOE requirement for years, even after the district is no longer identified as significantly disproportionate. There are ways to reduce that, but it takes some effort and some intentionality to do that. So I wanted to share that. The last slide is really just a visualization of the 27 months and the idea that, one budget cycle, we can just run through the whole animation. One budget cycle for 2021, starting July of this year, you have 27 months to expend that money, if you will. But then in 21-22, if there's another designation for that district, which most of the districts identified in California are in the area of identification. And I would say to most districts, expect that you'll have 2, 3, sometimes 4 years of an identification of SIG-DIS in that area, because moving the mark, if you will, in terms of identification for significant disproportionality for indicator 9 and 10 is a challenge. You're looking at identification patterns for students with disabilities. So theoretically, during the 21-22 school year, you could have two kind of budget cycles that are operating at the same time. And so I wanted to just kind of share this a little bit and turn it back over to Connie really and the SPP-TAP team to address some of those questions that are more fiscally embedded, but these were some visualizations that we wanted to share with you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, John. And we have a couple questions. I'm first going to say that yes, the slides will be able to share all of these slides with you guys following the session. And again, remember, it will be archived so you can get that as well. We actually have a follow-up. We have our June Community of Practice meeting for SIG-DIS districts that will be on June 9th. And I think I'll go ahead and show the next slide so I can just have those visual while we're talking. But I do want to ask Jen we had a couple questions tied to budget. So as soon as I get through these opportunities, if you could reread the questions to me, that would be great, because I think they were important questions. So coming up, we've touched on these, but we have additional webinars for everyone. One is June 2nd, and this is called Holding Challenging Conversations Online. So we have an expert, his name is William All, who's an expert in online collaborations that will be providing information. Again, this is meant to support districts because it certainly is looking as though we are going to continue to have some kind of restrictions around how much we can gather. So we're hoping that that will help everyone with things like their stakeholder groups and gathering qualitative data. We also on June 16th have another webinar coming, Unpacking and Addressing Hispanic Disproportionality. This is going to be provided by two of our California experts who are also our TA facilitators. So that's Dr. Zaida McCall Perez and Dr. Paul Luelmo. So we know many of you are out in the areas around our Hispanic students, Latino students. So that's a good one for you to participate in. And then on June 30th, we have one called the 8 R's of Trauma, Responsive Mindset, and Approach to Educating in Our New Normal. This is by Toby Scruggs Hussein and Dr. Sean Neely Opara. And again, we know that trauma is huge right now, and it will continue to be even when we gather up again, whenever we get to our new normal, as we are right now, and how it changes. So that'll be an important one. Again, more tips and resources for addressing both student, family, and staff needs around trauma responsiveness. So I mentioned the COP, the one on June 9th, we are to focus on budget guidance. We know there's a lot of questions around that, so we'll spend some time again with some additional TA facilitators that have quite a bit of experience in helping districts with this. And then just a reminder that we have workshop Bs that we will be happening in the fall, so we'll set those up, and again, whether or not they're virtual or face-to-face or some combination, we'll obviously be sharing with you soon. So I'm going to stop so that Jen can reread our questions and I can answer those. I know that our end time is 1:45, so I apologize, but if we can get through these couple questions, we should be able to send you on your way. Thanks.
Yeah, Connie, we only have a couple at this point. If people add more, we can address those if we have time. The first question was, with the layoffs inevitable and the guidance not to supplant funds, are we able to use some of these funds to rehire a position like an MTSS coordinator as an example?
Okay. So we'll definitely talk about this in more detail during the community of practice. But what I want to say is that the challenge in that is if you had a service that was provided prior, and even though it has ended, the purpose of your CCEIS is to provide some additional interventions that weren't there in place before, because you're going to make something specific to the target students that need additional supports. So even if you don't consider it supplanting, like you're not able to provide this, so you're looking for funds to provide it. If it's not different than what you provided before, you're going to run the risk of it basically looking like supplanting, and in fact being activities that won't address your disproportionality. However, if there's something along those lines that is now focused to your target population, and you do use folks that were laid off previously, but the activities are different, that could potentially be something that works. So again, that's a very quick answer to a complicated question, but just want to kind of give some of the things to consider in that situation. And there was another one.
Yes, and the second question was, since the school 2021 budgets are projected to be significantly impacted, what are the considerations for mitigating the budgetary impacts of this process?
So that, again, that might be something we want to talk about in more detail, but as I think that Jack mentioned this at the very beginning, the Office of Special Education Programs has not given any waivers due to COVID-19 to IDEA funding around Part B funds and SIGDIS. So CDE doesn't have the authority to make any kind of exceptions to that. Jack, I don't know if you want to say something different, but.
Yeah, I mean, that's what everybody was waiting on. And if you look at the report to Congress that came out April 27th by Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, DeVos, the only IDEA waiver authority recommendation was around Part C to B. Everything else, there was nothing. So which means we have to move forward.
Okay. Again, I hope that you will join us at that budget COP and recommend that you invite your fiscal folks if that will be helpful to you, because we will be spending more time on that. I'm just quickly going to show you this slide, which shows some of the additional resources that we have available for you. There's been updates to the SIGDIS CCEIS plan, so you'll want to definitely make sure that you're going back to the website or the Padlet, so you're using the most current documents, and also the guidance document. Minor changes, but you want to make sure you're using the most recent one. The new materials we talked about today, the pacing guide and the policies, practices, and procedures review, those are definitely being shared with you now and also will be on our website. And then we want to remind you that we have a variety of e-learning modules. These are excellent resources for you to use, especially right now while everyone is separate. It's a good way to get some foundational information to all of your district team members, your stakeholder team, your leadership team. There are a couple that are specific, relatively new and specific to the root cause analysis process, one on qualitative data and one on quantitative data. So highly recommend that you take a look at those. They're on our website under the resources tab. You'll find all of our e-learning modules there. So want to thank everyone. Thank you for your time. Really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you, Jack, and your team at CDE for making this possible. And of course, John, Mildred, Dennis, thank you very much. You guys were awesome as always. And then I do just have to give a shout out to my amazing team, Jen, Susan, and Davina. Thank you. Okay, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Again, we'll be seeing you hopefully very soon. Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.